Hmm? Okay. All right. My name is Janice Sanders, and today we're going to be talking about back in the day to discuss how um, stories of the past are relevant today. And our guest speaker author today is Pat Davis. Could you wave, Pat? And Olivia Ray, um, Cindy Thompson, Cleo, how do you, Lampos,
Lampos.
Lampos, and Anne Mulligan. Okay, so the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask a question, and then I'll assign people to answer, or I'll just say everybody can. And then I'll give questions as they come up on my screen. And let's get started. My first question, um, what compelled your choice of historical stories to write? Um, do you write any other genres? And I'm going to choose Olivia and Cleo. So, Olivia, you go first.
Okay. Um, the book that I'm featuring at the festival, I was over in England and I learned about Lady Jane Grey and how she tragically died at a young age and was the queen, believe it or not, of England for 9 days.
Mhm.
And I thought, wow, what a tragic story. She was used by her father and um, the guy that was originally King Edward, who had passed away, was his regent, more or less. And I thought, well, what would have happened had she lived? So that was the premise of that story. And so I spun off my story from that. I like to write historicals. I have a whole medieval series too. I feel that it's a more spiritual era, so I can and there was a lot of conflict at those times with religion. So it just drawed me to write about those time periods. But I do also have one contemporary. Okay.
Okay. Cleo.
I write about the orphan trains a lot. I went to visit my brother and sister-in-law in Minnesota, and we went to the Stern County Museum. And in that gift shop, I'm a gift shop junkie. I went to the gift shop, lots of books there, but all of these books had a train and all of these kids in front of a train, raggedy little kids. And so I said, what is all of this? I've never seen books like this. And that had this Stern County area was one of the places where people adopted children off the orphan train. So they had written all of these stories of all of these children. 250,000 children rode the orphan train. I knew nothing about it. I was a teacher. I bought as many books as my husband would let me, started reading about the orphan train, went to the orphan train reunion where there were still four survivors of the orphan train. They were in their late 90s. So I met them. And then all the descendants of people from the orphan trains went to the orphan train museum in Concordia, Kansas, and read more books, bought more books about the orphan train. This took several years while I was still teaching. And I taught children in an urban setting. And I was a special ed teacher, emotionally disturbed, um, behavior disordered boys. So they were kids with problems. So when I read about these orphan kids, it was just like the kids in my class. There was very little difference. It was just years difference between them. So I became very impassioned with this. But my question was, what kind of mother would allow their children to go on an orphan train when obviously they weren't orphans? And who is the person out there in Nebraska, who's in Iowa, who's taking these kids in? What kind of people were they? And those are the people that I wrote about in A Mother's Song. The mother who had to let her children go, and the woman who adopted those children. And from that, I wrote 2 other books with the orphan train in it, Riding the Rails to Home, which is about a little newsie who rides the rails, and then another book that has orphan train kids in it. And this comes from, I think, my teaching, the fact that I had been in a foster home, the whole idea of children out there with no parents, no home, wanting a forever family.
Okay. Don't forget to put your questions in the chat for anyone who's listening in. My next question is for everyone. Can we talk a little about the difference in importance of values of religion in the past versus the present day? How your book may or may not touch on that, but how things that happened in the past is different as far as religion is concerned with the way it is today. Anybody?
Well, my book that's nonfiction that I'm promoting at the festival this year, Celtic Song. I've written mostly fiction, but this is nonfiction, and it is inspired by the ancient Celts and their ancient religion, their form of Christianity. So there are things in it that I think we need to be reminded of to kind of get back to our roots, how much they relied on the book of Psalms, why the rhythms and the why they memorized Psalms, because of the rhythms. Books weren't readily available, like, of course, like today. So it's a huge part of my little nonfiction book, exploring the ancient roots of Christianity in these Celtic nations.
Well, I think in times gone by that people recognize God's sovereignty in that he ruled in the affairs of men. My book, When Valleys Move Again, is set in the Second World War. And I think that generation who lived through that period of time had a greater dependency upon God and looked to him to protect them, to give guidance. And I think they realized that God did rule in the affairs of man. They had a deeper respect for the church and the teachings of the Bible. They tried to, at least in my story, both my characters, Abby and Jim, were raised by Christian parents. Abby was raised in England, and her father was a British diplomat. Actually, he was a diplomat to America prior to the Second World War. And then just a few years before the war broke out in England in 1939, he had moved his family to England after his term in the United States was complete. But he too raised his daughter Abby to hold on to the Lord. And when she's leaving England in 1939 to come to America, where she was born in America, he presses a Bible in her hand and tells her that all things work together for good to those who love the Lord. And throughout the course of the story, she is challenged with that, and she learns that that is true. That is true. She can look back upon experiences of having lived here during the war years, from 39 to 44, and having seen God's hand in her affairs. And Jim too, he was an American, and he became an infantryman. And when he went to the battlefield, he remembered the promises in God's word, and they helped to sustain him through those very harrowing experiences over in France and in North Africa. And I do believe the people of my parents' generation, which was the great generation, had a deeper respect for spiritual things.
Okay, Anne?
Well, I believe that people in the past really tended to have more of a childlike faith. I noticed today that everyone is striving to understand every bit of it, why, and all of those things. And I see in society a lot of people actually trying to gain level with God by understanding and knowing things. But in the past, people accepted. Sometimes they had trouble with it. In my book, In High Cotton, she doesn't always see God's answer around her and only really needs to look as close as her friends.
Okay. Anyone else?
I was just thinking about my book, A Life Renewed. My characters, they are of conflict back at that time because religion, the whole society in England and in Europe at that time revolved around religion. And at that time we had between the Catholics and the Protestants. And you think, boy, those are both Christian faiths, but yet they fought among themselves as to what was a true faith and what was a heretic faith. And my characters had to come to the resolution that God is in all men's hearts that believe in him and believe in Jesus Christ. So I think that, if you talk about the difference between then and now, you still have conflict with religion, only now more so with religious groups and non-religious groups, or which groups are truly preaching the word of Jesus Christ. And it's always a conflict. And I think that you will see that all through history. And you see that even in biblical history. So I think that is just how the devil tries to get at us. And he will use any means he can, be it inside the church or outside the church.
Cleo, sorry.
Oh, Cleo. I think that the problems of yesterday are still the problems of today. We have the same fears, we have the same difficulties, we have the same challenges that people had before, and the word of God is what gets us through it. One person wrote about my book, A Mother's Song. I learned a little bit about quilting, but I learned a lot about facing difficulties. And the difficulties of today are exactly what people 100 years ago were facing, or during World War II. We all face these kinds of things. And so no matter what time period you're in, you're talking about how does faith impact your difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Name one event in your book that you think we could learn from in today's world. And has there been a situation in current times that inspired you to look at how it would have been handled in the past? Olivia?
One example in my, could you repeat that part again, the first part? One example in my
Okay.
book that,
In your book that you think we could learn from in today's world from your
well,
book?
I just think about learning that people should try to listen to each other, understand where people come from, and then try to in that way, if you listen and understand where each other comes from, you usually can come to a common ground. In my book, neither of them necessarily turned from their religion of choice. I guess I'm going to use that as a word, but they both had the same faith. They both realized that Jesus Christ died for their sins. So therefore, they thought they could get together on that common bond and then go forward from there. And I think that's still true to today. I think if you show kindness and love to one another, even in terrible situations, there still can be some common ground and people can still get along.
Cindy?
I just think that all of it, that history has lessons to teach us today. I don't think we should ignore any of it. I'm not sure that answers your question too broadly, but I like to look back at history.
Mhm.
People struggled with things that we struggle with. How did they overcome them? How did they deal with them? What did they learn that we need to know? History is important.
Okay, I have a question from Melissa. Um, when researching your stories, did any of the authors visit with their clergy?
Could you repeat that last part?
Did any of you visit your clergy when you were writing your story as for research?
Did we go to the location on which our story was set? Is that
Clergy.
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 Pastor.
Oh,
Or
thank you.
Okay. She said any author. So, anyone want to answer that?
I did. I usually shoot. Maybe don't always visit in person with him, especially during this COVID-19 era. But I sent anytime I had a question on biblical grounds, on if am I doing this wrong? Am I looking at this wrong? I always went to him on it. Fortunately, the Lord was with me, and all of them were. I had the right idea. And he just usually gave me a few extra scriptures to back it up. And so, yes, I do like to connect with my pastor.
Anyone else? Okay. I have another question from Julie. She wants to know, she says, I'm fascinated with all the subjects in history you all write. How do you know when you have researched a subject enough and you are ready to write? She didn't specify, so
I'll tell you real quick on mine. I research some, but a lot of it I do as I go along. Because points come up. I'm a seat of the pants writer, so I don't always know where my story is going. And when something comes up, I jump online and research. Occasionally, I have to take a trip to somewhere and do some research. All of mine are local in Georgia.
okay. Well, Cindy, I know you do a lot of research overseas, or you did. So this sounds like something for you.
yeah, none of us are going anywhere these days, but
Yeah.
I like to
So
do a
when did
lot
you
of
know-
research before I start writing. I like to be overwhelmed with the material before I start writing. But once I start writing, it seems like you hit something and it's like, oh, I didn't really know enough about that. And you're constantly researching all the way through. And then when you're done, it's like, and it's out there, you think, well, I should have covered this and this and this. The research never really stops. You know,
Okay.
there's just so much to know that you just keep on researching and writing blogs maybe on things that come up. But I have to get into the whole thing and be immersed in it before I can write.
Yeah, I think I understand what she's asking. At some point, you do have to start writing. You may miss some things. My first book was published in 2006. A year or two ago, somebody pointed out some things, some historical inaccuracies that were in there, but that this is 5th, 6th century Ireland, and the average reader wouldn't realize they didn't have donkeys at that time, and I missed that in my book. I think you've got to give yourself a little leeway. You do the best that you can. And when you feel like you've done enough research, tell your story. I mean, as long as it makes sense, your readers aren't going to, hold you to the fire for putting a donkey in a 5th century novel in Ireland. So,
Okay. Um, this one is sort of like what I asked before, but it's from Barbara. Do you tend to write in one time period or several?
Well, my first novel, my only novel so far, is When Valleys Mimic, set in World War II. The one I'm working on now, at least up until recently, is set at the turn of the 20th century during the Progressive Era. So that is 2 different time periods.
I've been in ancient Ireland. I'm trying to get out of ancient Ireland. I finished a novel that was set World War I, World War II, still in Ireland, also in America. But I have written several books that are ancient Ireland, the early Christian period in Ireland.
I would say my books, or my medieval series, started in 12th century England. And by the time I got to the 5th book, I was in France. And then I had to go back to England. And my series that I'm working on now, the one with the Life Renewed, that first book took place in Tudor England. So, we're moving ahead a couple hundred years, but it's always new research. And then I decided to take the book I'm working on now, to take it up to Scotland. And then I kind of hit myself on the head thinking, why would I do that? Why would I go into another area where I have to research another whole time period? Yeah, it's quite exhausting. But the story, I just felt the story needed to go there. So
My first 7 books were contemporary. And then the story of In High Cotton had been playing around with me for a long time, set in the Great Depression. And when I wrote it, I fell in love with it. It's still my same brand. I write books that are that have an ensemble cast of strong women who are facing life's issues together. And the strength and faith is what gets them through. So no matter what era I write, my readers get the same thing. They're always going to find that in my books. But I fell in love with writing the Depression, the Great Depression. So I've got 4 books in this series. I'm writing the 4th one right now. So it's I'm enjoying it. So I don't know where I'll go from there. I may just camp out here for a while.
Okay.
My books travel from the 1850s to modern times, but the thread that runs through all of them is children who need a safe place, children who need a forever home, children who need a family. And whether it's by my series of the Teachers of Diamond Project School, which is an imaginary urban school, these teachers are reaching out to these kids. Same thing with the Orphan Train. People reaching out, taking those children and finding them those forever homes. So that's, I think, the thread that goes through all my books is children with needs.
If I can make a little comment to Cleo too, I have a very good friend whose uncle was an orphan on one of those orphan trains. So while I don't write about it, I love those stories.
Yeah, the great stories, great stories.
This is about the orphan train. About a month ago, me and two of my girlfriends, she was telling this story, something she read that she didn't know about. And she didn't say orphan train, but she was talking all about the situations. And I said, yeah, that was probably from the orphan trains that were through. And they didn't know anything about it. And I had to tell them a little bit about it, what the orphan train was. And it was like news to them. They didn't know about it, but it's very interesting. And some of those kids had a very hard time.
Very hard.
Pat, I know this is your first book, but Olivia, do you write about anything other than historical? That was the question.
I have one contemporary out. I really like it. It's about there's a child in there who does have special needs, and the conflict between a father who comes back from doing missionary medical mission, and his son doesn't know him anymore, and he is living because his wife passed away, so he's living with a caretaker, and she isn't quite sure he is a good father. So yeah, I like to write stories with children in them too, because I think children, tug at people's heartstrings, and it's fun. I mean, even in the book I'm writing about now, it has a little boy, and I guess I like to write with little boys. I think they're fun to write about. So.
I have a two-part question, but the first part is, do any of you write about one location? I mean, all your books take place in one location, or do you move the stories to different locations?
Well, the two stories that I have written, the one is not completed yet.
Oh.
They all have an Anglo-American connection. My husband's British, and I have family in Britain.
Yeah,
I know. And yes, so the one I've been working on, the one set in the Progressive era, but it starts out in London, and the protagonist is a suffragette. And then she's there for additional schooling, and that's where she gets involved with the suffragist movement. But then she brings her ideas and thoughts back to the United States. And the year is 1911. The movement has become rather militant in England, causing a lot of disturbance in England. But the women there is just as eager to get the right to vote. And will take approximately 9 more years before they do in this country. And even when they got the vote in England, it was only women who were married and above a certain age initially. So yes, my protagonist is a suffragist, but she's also the administrator of a settlement house. So she has involvement, watch care over the immigrants coming into Philadelphia from places like Italy. And a large majority of the story will be set in Philadelphia in the Italian section. But my stories will always have an Anglo-American connection.
Mine all take place in Georgia. Oh, I was gonna say mine all take place in Georgia.
Okay, that's the reason I asked is because in another panel yesterday, some of you were in there. There was a lady that she only write about this one particular place, and all her books were in one place. And so I was just wondering if anybody else did that, or if you move your characters and stories from one place to another. And you said yours is all in Georgia.
They are one book I have that goes back and forth between New York and Georgia within the book. But otherwise, yes, always in Georgia, but I choose different places within the state.
Okay. If you don't always have the same place, um, are your stories always in real places? And if not, how do you come up with these imaginary places?
Oh,
I'd love to answer that one if I can.
Go ahead, Anne.
Okay. Unless I'm writing about Sugar Hill, which is where I live and absolutely love, we call it my sweet city. It's a small town. Unless I'm writing about Sugar Hill, I make all up my towns. I have, on my website, and I also have on my wall some maps and whatnot that I've drawn. And that's the first thing I do. I draw out my town. I know what the streets are. I know where the stores are. I know where every character's house is. And I did it for my Chapel Springs series, and I've done it for each town here. And it is my preference, because then I can place things where I want them. But if they're in, like I said, in Sugar Hill, then I have to stick to what Sugar Hill is or was at the time.
Okay.
All of
Anybody else?
mine are that are published are real historical places, or my Ellis Island series obviously was in New York City. But the book that I just finished that I'm trying to shop, I did create, part of it takes place in New York City, New Jersey, which is this kind of a general along the shore kind of place, not really placing any place particular, and then finishes in a town that I made up in Ohio. So it's central Ohio, so it's a little bit kind of like where I live, but it's an imaginary place. So that's the first time I've done that.
In my stories, they're all real places. In When Valleys Bloom Again, the location is in an area in which I grew up in post-World War II. So I set this story there, and it was really wonderful last year when I was doing book signings, when I could do that. I went to that location, and there would be people that would come along and say, oh, they remembered that from 40, 50 years ago. They would say, yes. And it was really quite exciting to be back in that area in Westchester, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and have a large portion of my story set there during the war years. And I think that made the book quite attractive to the people living in that area now. So yeah, I made it a point to go into Westchester frequently last year. They had a connection.
Mm-hmm.
Olivia?
Well, the book that I just finished, A Life Renewed, it started in England. It started in the Tower of London. All that was accurate. And then I took the story across to a German town that I totally made up. I put it in an area. I looked at towns around the area of northern Germany, which wasn't called Germany back then. But I looked at towns around there, and I kind of patterned it after one of those. But I didn't use that exact town because I wanted to create different people. And I wanted to have a different lord that was in control of that area. So yeah, I'll use real information, and I'll create other information, but I always put a disclaimer on that, because there will be somebody that'll tell me that town doesn't exist. And I go, yeah, I know.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Cleo?
Um, a mother's song had to be in New York City because that's where it starts, where the Irish immigration comes in, where you're going to get all of these orphan kids from. So I had to research the Five Points area and know exactly how the people live there, what kind of tenements they lived in, and all of those kind of facts so that everything is historically correct. So I try real hard.
Okay. But what the places where the kids go, did you have to make any of those up?
It's good old Nebraska, Iowa farms, and I lived on Iowa farms, so I know all about Iowa farms and Iowa people. So that part was really easy to just, make up a farm and some folks that love kids.
Okay. Don't forget to put your questions on the chat. I know you're writing in the past, and some of you may have churches or whatever in the stories that don't exist. How do you come up with these churches or research these churches that don't exist, if you have anything like that? Nope, nobody?
I have chapels, but I create my own chapels within the keep. So it's not a church.
Yeah, my Ellis Island books, obviously New York City, but I modeled a church on a real church, but it was, it was made up. And the reason that I did that was because I was trying to stay historical and have an actual church that, existed in the early 1900s that these immigrants might have gone to. But then I got so caught up in the research of who was the minister then, what was his name, what was he like, and do I really want to, if I can find that out, do I really want to put words in that man's mouth? And so that's why imaginary church that was similar to something that actually did exist.
I have an imaginary parish church in Newton Abbey, which is in the south of England. The vicar is a pattern after some information I had read, historical information, but he plays a pivotal role at the end of the story. Yes, and I'm having, the book is being narrated at the present time, and the woman who's doing it is very professional. She's giving the vicar an Australian accent, so we're trying to get the English accent right in the audio version, and that's difficult. There's Cockney, then there's the more posh English accent. But yes, this vicar he's quite a colorful person too.
Okay.
Where I've found some problems, not so much with the church, is getting some research correct when I'm doing a real town, Sugar Hill, that wasn't a town until 1939. It was a militia district only. And most of the history is oral right now. It has not been digitized. It's not written down anywhere. And I've had to do an awful lot of talking with people and a whole lot of author note to tell people, I don't know. We have a store that was in 3 different places. And I finally have to decide, for sake of story, to put it here. And I realize that somebody will say, it wasn't there, it was over there. And this is why I prefer a fictional town. But you have to do that sometimes. The church my church was, the church I go to was started in the 1800s. So I knew that was there.
Since there's no other questions, I have one that, have you ever taken someone that is in current time and put them in the past. I know that there are personalities and things like that that people have now that existed back then. And perhaps you see a person or a situation and you think, well, this would work in this story. Have you ever done that? And how do you change that? How do you change that person or make it fit? Um, Olivia.
I have never tried to use somebody from current times. I mean, I have real historical people in my books. I'll interject them and put them in that they show up in different scenes, but I can't say that I've ever thought I'm going to use this guy that I know now and put him back in the past. That I haven't done.
Well, I meant like his personality or
Yeah.
something that
You know
worked.
what? I guess what I tried to do when I used real historical figures, I kind of researched what they were like, and then I kind of add in what I think their personality would be. You know, like when I used King Richard, I thought, well, he's a real confident guy, and then that just goes throughout the whole story when I was writing my medieval series. I mean, but I can't say that I've looked at a person's personality from this time period and thought, I'm going to use that because I think that fits this guy. No, it just doesn't work that way for me. Usually the characters speak to me. So, and they tell me how they want to be.
Okay. Let's see. Chloe.
Yeah.
I haven't taken anybody from this century and put them back, but I think human emotions are the same. When you read the stories of orphan children, and there's 250,000 of them, so they've written so many of them, and I read so many of them. This same emotions these kids have, being homeless and trying to fit in with a new family, are the same emotions that the children in my classrooms were having, the same emotions I had going into foster care. So human nature is the same, whether it's 100 years ago or today. So it's kind of hard to say I'm taking someone from here and putting them in the past, because these things are very useful.
Okay. Anne.
Oh, I definitely do. And I've had some of my friends give me permission to use them, their personality, and their name. And that has been a blast to do occasionally. And obviously, the character has to be a good character. I have one in High Cotton, Sadie Moreland. And while my close friend that I used is not half Indian, Yamasee Indian, she's still, the character is, but everything about this character is this friend of mine. And it was fun putting her back there because she got to do things, obviously, that she doesn't do today, or has an easier time of doing them today. So yes, I enjoy doing that, and I do it quite often, but I always have permission. I always talk to them about it.
Okay. Pat, have you ever done that?
Are you addressing me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, have you done that? No, but I'm thinking, I used my maiden name for one of the characters back in in my time period in 1940s. I've done that, but no, no, I don't. No, I haven't done that.
Okay. Who's left? Cindy.
Well, we're talking about my fiction here, right? Because I have a nonfiction book, but I think I have a little bit. I know that in my Ellis Island series that the pastors were really inspired by some pastors that I had when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, a story that I wrote that didn't get published, I gave the pastor that pastor's name. Um, so right offhand, I can think of that I have done that. My main characters are probably more of a mix of personalities that I've known, maybe not anybody specific.
Okay. I have one more question from Barbara. Do you have a favorite craft book or writing or a book that helps with getting history correct? A resource book, it sounds like.
Yeah, I just want to say, can you see behind me? Because these are my research books. Um, I don't have one, but I do have, I'll show you. These books, there's two of them, A Social History of Ancient Ireland, written by P.W. Joyce, who was a historian from, these books were written around 1900. He did a lot of research on the um, the social history of these people back then when I was writing, which was it's hard to do research on such an early time period unless you're writing biblical fiction. So this had a lot of information on there, not just their religion, but their clothing and what they ate and how they traveled, and just that was a wealth of information. So that's one of my favorites. But I love research books. I probably have too many.
In the 1970s, a group of people started talking. They were older people. They were talking about their childhood, and they remembered coming on a train to Minnesota. And they started to say, well, my uncle came on a train to Minnesota. And they started to talk to each other, and they realized that they had all been coming on these trains to Minnesota. What was it? And they realized that they were part of this movement of the orphan train. They knew they had been adopted, but they really didn't realize how extensive that was, that there were 250,000 of these children out there. So they started going into the public schools and talking to the children about their experiences. And because of that, people started writing their stories down and making books out of them. That was my research, was reading their stories, just reading them and absorbing them and just letting them fill me with their emotions. And it was so powerful because every story was so individual, and the people that took them in were all just different people. So it took me a long time to read all of this, but the research was very personal because those were the real stories. And wow, that's a great way to start writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
My husband's father served in the British Eighth Army from 1939 to 1944. And of course, my husband has some of the memorabilia from those years, Army gear. My father-in-law was in the infantry. And behind me are all kinds of books on English history, Second World War, numerous books on Churchill and the war years. And my husband grew up in post-World War England, middle 50s and on. And yeah, he remembers the ruins still existing, structures yet to be torn down and replaced with others, ruins, and the rationing was still going on in England up until the middle 50s, I think, probably late 50s. They had rationing all from, I guess, 1940. Maybe they had rationing for 15 years. I don't know, 40. Anyway, it was a very long time. So yes, I'm surrounded with Second World War history. I have been ever since I married my husband 38 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
What else would I write in?
Right.
History anyway. I love history. And as I said, my family served in the Second World War. Great uncles, served in the Second World War. Yes, and of course I've talked to my father-in-law who, as I said, was with the British Eighth Army. He had only been married 2 months when he was conscripted. So he was in the war, and he was at Dunkirk, Normandy, North Africa, throughout Europe, and only came home quite infrequently, over 7 years almost, and only been married for 2 months.
Oh,
So I heard those stories.
Okay. Well,
I love
we-
little small town books. Every town usually has a history book of their town. And I pick those up wherever I go, whether I'm writing about that town or not. It could form the basis of another great one. And it's very personal history.
okay.
I just wanted to say Janice, you did a great job moderating, and thank you all for all our authors tonight. This was very enjoyable, very informative, and it was fun to learn about you and your books.